Hello and welcome to episode 65 of The Garden Log with me, Ben Dark. I am a gardener and this is my gardening podcast. This episode comes from the penultimate week of August 2019. The mornings are getting cold. I know this because everyone I talk to mentions that the mornings are getting cold and how much they enjoy it. And I enjoy it too. I'm not a monster. I like that feeling of freshness, the crispness, the knowledge that change is here, and we have that September new start, new dawn. Everything will be perfect. I will be a perfect man. I will be the perfect gardener. Feelings bubble around me and all those people I meet. We haven't had any misty mornings yet. I'm waiting for the valley bottoms to fill up as I trundle past them on my morning train. At the moment they're shiny with dew, but they're not yet full of water fumes. This week I have been planting with mist in mind. I've been planting a sort of pagan grotto, something that might have existed before the English village church was invented, a place for our distant forebears to get together and think mystical thoughts. Or that's how I am describing it to the garden owners. I'm also doing a bit of hedge repair. I am cutting down some musical plants. That's quite an interesting thing to do. And I am weeding in preparation for some great big planting projects. There's a lot to get through this week. We got some weather, as we always do. So we really don't have any more time for introductions. Let's get on with the week in gardening. Welcome to the week in gardening. A week that began, like so many others recently, with my trenching shovel in hand. I was digging a trench at the base of a mature beech hedge in order to fill in a vast hole that has appeared in the hedge. And you might be wondering how on earth I have allowed a huge hole to appear in a mature beech hedge. It might be like that time in 2017 when I burnt a beech hedge with the exhaust pipe from my digger. Drove all the way along it, and the exhaust scorched a perfect line like a single Adidas stripe along the shoulder of someone's tracksuit. And I only realised after the job was done. Not like this time. This time the hedge has developed its own hole. There was an outbuilding against the hedge, and this has been taken down. And beech is a sensible sort of plant. It's not going to waste time and effort and resources growing leaves that are only going to shove against the back of the hedge and do nothing. So it gives up on this part and grows up and out and over the top. And now the shed has gone and I'm left with a cavern, a sort of hole like you would find at the bottom of a porous sea cliff, something in limestone or chalk that has been bashed by waves for a couple of thousand years and has slowly become undermined. Now the hedge has that impression, and that isn't particularly aesthetically pleasing. We don't really want to see what goes into making a beech hedge. We don't want to see those twisted stems and the little hedgy weeds that grow around the base of trees and those tendrils of ivy just growing up those first few thick stems. What we want to see is a wall of green leaves, something that could have been copied and pasted from other sections of the hedge to create one uniform whole. And so I went off shopping for hedging plants, and it is of course the entirely wrong time of year. Your hedging plants should be bought from November through to March, when the plants are nice and dormant and you can plop them into the soil and they don't even notice that they've been shipped halfway across Europe. They just wake up and say, all right, spring again. Gosh, this doesn't feel a lot like Holland, but never mind, I'll put out some leaves and get on with it. No, in August things are different, and nurseries know this. They know that sensible gardeners aren't planting hedges, so they have no hedging stock in at all. It's impossible to find it. I searched through the countryside, and in the end I went to my regular nursery. This is a lesson in capitalism. You get looked after by the people you spend money with. This is why those people in first class get their glass of champagne from a real glass, because goodness knows they're keeping the airline afloat. I've been keeping nurseries afloat for a while now, so I went down to one I used regularly and said, please, can you help me? I need some beech whips, 2-year-old, to fill a gap. And they took me to the special plant graveyard section of the nursery, where unsold stock has a sort of purgatory period in between being sold and going on a bonfire, where things could go either way. And there I was able to rescue a few plants. The nurseryman was very good, very, very honest and upright and forthright about things. He said that these plants were potted on from root-balled stock only a few months ago, and we potted them onto a very sandy soil, so when you lift them out, you're probably going to lose all of the roots and all of those little micro roots that take up water, which means the plant will immediately go into a shocked sort of sulk, and the leaves will droop, if not fall off entirely. Are you okay with that? He said. And I, being in a bit of a bind, said, yes, of course I am. Of course, I know that would happen. Of course. And bought them anyway, and took them home and then played one of those incredible games, like an archaeologist finding some incredibly delicate, filigree Anglo-Saxon gold work in a field in East Anglia and easing it out of the sucking soil without it falling apart. I was trying to ease off these pots while keeping the root ball intact. And I managed it, in the main part. I think 12 or 13 of them came out with this perfect mould of the pot still around the roots, and I very gently deposited them in the trench and backfilled with compost. And now it is a hedge once more, and it will remain a hedge in the eyes of those who walk past it. I was quite pleased with that, and I carried on the out-of-season planting vibe into Tuesday. I began Tuesday with a bit of sort of summer maintenance, more normal jobs, taking wisteria away from windows. The wisteria has a brilliant knack to get into gaps. It gets into slightly open windows at the base of the window, and then gets right up inside, and then sort of panics like a sparrow that has found itself in your kitchen. It doesn't really want to be there and comes batting back against the window. This is what the wisteria was doing. It had grown up inside and it was trying to get out again once more. So I cut all the wisteria back, leaving more of a structure and allowing there'll be another flush of summer growth, but now it's got space to go and get up to mischief once more and grow into more little things and places and try and tear down the gutters once again. But we have now a month's grace where we don't have to get on the ladders. And after that I planted some hedging yew. I bought these at the same time. I bought them from the plant graveyard at the nursery. They are hedging yew, and they're about 2 meters tall. So big plants, but they are unsold stock once more, taken by me at a vast discount. So they have slightly uneven faces and are generally looking a bit ropey and rough. But I thought I'd take them with me because I had an idea to start some one-day sort of topiary. I always buy topiary already toperized at the vast markup that entails, and I thought I'd quite like to give some a go myself. I didn't want to do anything particularly fine. I didn't have the skills or shears sharp enough for peacocks or anything like that. What I want to do is create atmospheric sentinel blobs around a certain area of wild, unlooked-at garden. The bit of the garden where we planted a quince tree earlier in the year. And I quite like the idea of having a sort of grove, something slightly pagan, something that would look really good up to its ankles in mist. So these yew trees went around the quince tree at semi-irregular intervals in a sort of hemicircle, a little exedra of yew, as if they... It's not a semicircle as such, more like the curve of an upper eyelid. And the yew were planted there in this sort of pagan grove kind of setting. And I will chop them down to about half their height and then eventually form them into these sort of Lovecraftian figures, these hulking shapes coming out of the tree line and surrounding this quince tree as if they might be involved in some sort of arcane worship of their other tree friend. That's the idea anyway. It looks nice. It looks like a bit of garden has had some thought gone into it, but the character hasn't been essentially spoiled. I haven't gotten rid of the woodland character. It's something that is fun to play with, that dialogue. Empirically speaking, it looks fine. It looks like there are trees planted there and that a bit of space has been filled. But I'm hoping that the more sort of poetic observer maybe might see something else in it at a different time of day, in the winter, where the bracken and the brush that surrounds this bit of garden has died down a bit, and these trees will stand sort of stark and austere through that time of year. I think it could end up looking quite nice and quite interesting. And it's planting for the future. They won't look good for maybe 10 years. It'll take a long time to get them into the shapes that I one day envisage, but it really does feed the soul to work on something for the future. A lot of gardening that frustrates me is the kind of gardening that you do once and you know you're going to have to go and do it again in a week, leaf clearing or even wisteria cutting like I was doing earlier in the day. But this is gardening for the future, for the ages. So that left me feeling quite happy about things. And I think I needed some surplus happiness because on Wednesday it was incredibly wet. It was an all-day sort of rain, and it began benign and summery and almost quenching and wanted, one of those lovely sating summer rains that you think this is actually soaking in. And that was when the air was still and the rain was falling down and my boots were still waterproof. And in that morning bit, I did some cutting back. I cut back this vast ruin of delphinium, this huge pale blue delphinium cultivar that grows up to probably 2.2 meters, something like that, up to 8 foot. And it looks magnificent in its first flush, as long as it doesn't encounter any wind or rain. And then afterwards you cut off the main spires, and then you get these lovely little subsidiary minarets that come out, and they look nice. And then suddenly the whole thing just looks awful. It's reached a stage where there's more ruined cut ends, where you've cut off previous flowerings, than there is beauty in the promise of the future buds. So I cut that out right back to the ground. I really enjoy really mature delphiniums. Because when you cut them back, they make this wonderful noise in the hollow stem. They make a sort of wonk noise. And as you cut the stem up further to put in the compost heap, the noise changes. It's like one of those milk bottle orchestras where you blow on different volumes of water and it makes a different noise. So the stem makes a different noise as you cut it at different lengths. So you cut it back into very tiny pieces and it goes wonk, 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 which is pleasing to me anyway. So that's why my delphiniums always compost better, because I cut them into inch-long segments. Anyway, that was a good morning, and then the rain got wetter and more persistent, and a wind picked up, and my boots got soaked through, and all became a little bit more miserable. I planted out some wallflowers, which was a pleasing job. In this wet, I was working from boards on the lawn because we have quite sharp-edged lawns, and they drop off into the flower bed. And although it's summer, so you're not smearing mud anywhere, when the ground starts getting wet and you're working on the edge of grass like that, it has a tendency to sag and seep down, to do a little miniature landslide with you on it into the bottom of these things. So I was working on big boards, which makes things slower. But I planted out these wallflower Fire King, which we sowed in the early summer. And again, this is like the yew. It is something so inconspicuous and whiffily looking at the moment, but I know early next year it is going to look magnificent. It's there in place. It's like when you're cooking an amazing stock, and it's going to be 8 hours until you can taste this bone broth, but you know you're just storing up richness for the future. So that was a pleasant job to please me through the rain. On Thursday I stayed dry and warm and concentrated on the garden history, on the masters, so I won't go into that. And Friday saw me back in the rain once more, doing some cutting, doing some cutting with the hood up and the anoraks on, thinking, where on earth did this summer go? I was rescuing some Virginia creeper. We had heavy winds at the beginning of the week, and the garden at work was unscathed, but my garden at home has had some sort of Virginia creeper avalanche. It grows across this section of wall that I've got, and it's doing this wonderful thing where it's sending off those little Virginia creeper side stems, like the vines in a Tarzan film that grow down from above into great long ribbons. And that was all pulled off the wall by the rain, so I had to cut that back. And though it hadn't happened to the Virginia creeper, the newly planted Virginia creepers at work, I decided I didn't want to. So I went up and decided to help the plant out by tacking in some nails and tying them in. Virginia creeper has a self-suckering property. It is able to cling on its own. It has these fantastic branching tendrils that end in big sort of gecko pads on the end of them that can stick to things, but because they put on such a lot of leaf, they do tend to tear themselves down quite a lot when they're the young and new growth. So I tied those back on. And then I spent the day in general weeding. We have some big planting projects coming up, some exciting areas of the garden that are going to get makeovers and new looks. And I think it's always better to spend a really heavy time weeding and getting elsewhere in the garden perfect, so you don't have to worry that while you play around with artistic notions and wonder about pagan growths and mist in the morning, that everyone else who sees the garden is wondering, well, why on earth have they not built out this willow herb? Why are there 18 different dandelion relatives growing in this bed while he mucks around squinting at a rock and making sure that it has the right shade of green next to it? So I did that in preparation. Spent the whole rest of the morning and afternoon doing really in-depth weedings in the area that they were needed. I'll probably do something like that for the first half of next week before launching into the project plantings, securing the knowledge that the garden is looked after. And that was it. I think that is probably enough of me whittering on about my planting habits. Let's see if anyone else has anything worth recommending this week. Three recommendations for you this week, and you will be very pleased to hear that they are all visual recommendations. You do not have to sit here and listen to me reading you poetry or some other embarrassing nonsense. These are all things that you can go and find for yourself on the internet. The first is the work of an artist, a botanist and herbalist called Gerardo Cibo, and that is spelt Gerardo, Gerardo, and Cibo is Cibo, and he is a Genoese herbalist who was born in 1512 and I think died around the end of the 16th century. And I think he's absolutely brilliant. No one seems to have heard of him. If you search Gerardo Cibo on Google Images, you will come across some of the illustrations of plants he's collected, and firstly they're magnificently accurate. He draws plants perfectly. It is very much that Renaissance draftsmanship where the world is seen as it is, as opposed to in allegorical terms. But what I find him particularly brilliant for is his backgrounds. And sometimes he has ruins or waterfalls or mountains, basically the place where the plant was found. So he's recording the climate, the biome around the plant, way before it came popular, way before Alexander von Humboldt or our modern ideas of plant communities. And he also records the people on the trip with him, the people who are doing the plant hunting and how they're doing it. So in the background to these images, in the background to say his image of the hellebore, you'll find these little people, little bearded types in red cloth caps with these magnificent beards. I think that this is the time when gentlemen in Italy started to starch their beards, which probably accounts for a lot of the later troubles in the region. Anyway, they're all there in the background, and the weather in which he found the plants are there. There's one of this greater plantain. You know, greater plantain, it's a lovely little lawn weed with the ribbed leaves and that sort of bobbly seed stalk that comes up. Anyway, in that one, the heavens have opened on the trip where he collected it, and there's some poor shepherd getting thoroughly drenched, looking exactly like I might have done, standing next to his sopping, wet flock of sheep. So that's really, really well worth looking at. If you only look at one of these recommendations, I recommend becoming acquainted with Gerardo Sibo. I'm going to try and find out a little bit more about him. I think he was a writer, a correspondent. He was very much an aristo. He was probably a dilettante. His great-great-grandfather, I think, was Boniface VIII, that pope. He is into diaries and herbal lore. Anyway, I'm going to find out a little bit more about him, and I recommend you do the same. We can do a research along. My second recommendation is a silent film from 1926, which I found on the BFI site. The BFI has all of these archives of free films from just everyday life in Britain. And this one is the preparation and enjoyment of a garden party. It's a garden party near Reading, and it is the garden party of Solomon Joel, who was an East End boy turned South African diamond magnate. And he is preparing for this wonderful party at his estate in Maiden Early near Reading. And the garden in the background looks exactly like you would think a diamond magnate's garden would look like. There's this magnificent terraced structure with all sorts of things that look like white marble urns and fantastic figures and statues of racehorses around the place. I've been looking for information about this garden, but I think it was all demolished. There's a housing estate built on it now. But it might be worth someone, I might do it myself, turning in a paper on this Italian terrace garden, because it really looks quite something. Go onto the BFI site, and the film is called, for some reason, A Party at Fox Hill Estate. But if you search for garden party on there, you can click as a little tag, garden party, and it will show you all of the BFI's films about garden parties. There's a couple in Indian consulates, which are well worth watching as well, just for the costumes and the people you see in the background. So I hope you manage to go and have a look at some of those. And particularly in the Solomon Joel film, there's a magnificent shot of this magnate, hugely bearded, fantastically moustached. I don't know if there is some starch going into his facial hair as well. Anyway, he's there in his aviary, smoking a vast cigar and staring at this little tiny canary on his finger. It's a nice image. My third recommendation is slightly more prosaic, but is more in line with the garden log. If you enjoy what I do here, telling you about things that happen in the garden, then you're certainly going to enjoy this. It's about Hampton Court. It's on the Historic Royal Palace's website. If you search for Hampton Court, Our Growing Year, on Google, you will find a link to a page on that website where the gardening staff at Hampton Court have 4 little films made about the year. And obviously, as one is wont to do when splitting the year into 4, you take autumn, winter, spring and summer. And in each one, they talk a little bit about what the gardeners are up to. And they talk to everyone. They talk to the manager of the landscape. They talk to the people who are looking after the deers. They talk to the guys who manage the compost heaps, which I enjoy. And they get across the poetry and this sort of historical inheritance that you get when you work in a place like this. The gardeners all seem very aware of being in a line of gardeners that stretches 500 years behind them and should stretch 500 years in front of them, which is very exciting. It can get a little bit Historic Royal Palace's recruitment video drive-esque towards the end, but it's still really worth watching for an insight on how a garden on a vast scale with a vast staff works. So once more, that is on the Historic Royal Palace's website, Hampton Court, Our Growing Year. I'll put a little link to all 3 of these things in the show notes. I know that I don't really do show notes, but if you click on the more section on the podcast thing, then it should drop down and there'll be a little link to those things, and then you can watch along with me. I hope that those will keep you busy until next week. All that remains for me to do is to thank you very, very much for listening. I apologise once more for the delay, the summer holidays getting in the way. We are now back to broadcasting, so I hope you will join me again for episode 66 of The Garden Log next week. Thank you and goodbye.